Hello, and welcome to the Introduction to Autism course. There will be several voices that you will hear throughout the course. They're of the assistant psychologists within the autism team, and our names are Julie, Lee, Chrissy, Jahar, and Holly. So the course overview, going to look at the main areas of autism. Those are social communication, social interaction, restrictive, repetitive patterns of behaviour, also known as rigidity, and sensory. To start with then, we're going to have a look at some common myths and facts about autism. We're going to have a look at some statements and see if they are true or false. The first one, all people with autism prefer to spend time on their own. This one's false. Some people with autism like to spend time on their own, and that's okay, but some also like to be in the company of others. If your child is spending time alone, then as long as they are happy and content, that is okay, as long as they do have the skills to socialise if they want to. However, if they're unhappy or being alone because they are anxious or worried about something, then this may need further investigating, and strategies may need to be taught, which we will go into later. People with autism cannot make friends. This is false as well. They can make friends, although some children struggle to keep them, as they can't always read how their peer is feeling, understand why they behave as they do, and have to play by certain rules, and when these rules are broken or changed, they don't know how to cope with it. We'll explain more about this when we look into interactions later on. Autism is a lifelong condition, so children with autism become adults with autism. This is true. It is a lifelong condition, although people can learn strategies to help as they get older, and we'll learn more about these as the course goes on. You cannot see autism. This is true. You can't see autism as it's a difference inside the brain's pathway and processing of information. However, if you know autism well enough, you can sometimes see certain behaviours that are displayed as a result of the difficulties. People with autism struggle to understand social rules, facial expressions and tone of voice. This is true. One of the main difficulties associated with having an autism spectrum condition is the difficulty with social rules, and we will go over these in more detail a little later on. Autism only affects males. This is false. Autism affects both males and females, although there tend to be more males diagnosed. There are a few suggestions as to why this might be. The DSM criteria is largely based on observations from males, and males tend to display more obvious negative behaviours, indicating that they're struggling. We tend to find girls are diagnosed later on in life when they're a little bit older, as they tend to be able to mask their difficulties and copy social cues much better than boys can. Autism is usually developed at around 3 years of age. This is false. It is there from birth, as it is a lifelong developmental condition. We don't know what causes it, but we do tend to pick it up from as early as 2 or 3, as this is when the children tend to start going to nursery, and the difference in social skills can be noticed. It can be diagnosed at any point though throughout a person's life. People with autism cannot struggle with any mental health conditions, it's just their autism. This is false. Just because somebody has a diagnosis of autism spectrum condition, it doesn't mean that they can't then develop a comorbid mental health condition. Common ones include things such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, ADHD and OCD. Behaviours such as rocking and flapping can be calming for people with autism when stressed. This is true. During stressful times, repetitive behaviours such as rocking and flapping can be very calming. The reason why this is will be discussed later on, but it's important to note that if your child is exhibiting these behaviours, they're probably stressed and anxious about something, and so allow them to do it if it is safe and appropriate for them to do so.
A lot of people talk about autism as a spectrum, but there is also some confusion around what that means exactly. When we talk about the spectrum, we're not talking about how much autism someone has, we're talking more about their level of functioning that specific person has. Previously, you may have heard the term Asperger's for people that were particularly high functioning. Terms like classical autism have also been used in the past, but these are no longer recognised as separate diagnostic criteria, and they all come under the same umbrella of autism now. Children on the high end of the spectrum may show high intelligence, especially in their area of special interest. They may also do very well with learning the skills they struggle with, getting a good understanding of those difficulties, and learning strategies to make them less troublesome in later life. Children that are on the lower end of the spectrum may have additional needs, such as learning difficulties or being non-verbal. This can make skill learning a little trickier, but all children with autism have a chance to develop their skills and learning to manage those difficulties that they're finding particularly challenging. Although the diagnostic criteria have changed, searching for things online like Asperger's will still provide some helpful links and resources. This is simply to explain how the diagnostic criteria currently works and what we mean by a spectrum. The important thing to remember, however, is that we're all unique. Even though there is a diagnosis involved, we all have our own strengths, difficulties, interests and dislikes, our personality on top of it all. Autism affects everyone differently, and how they manage the difficulties may be different too. One thing to note is that due to the nature of autism, in finding social things particularly challenging, it is important to think about the fact we encounter these social things every day. So this might be particularly challenging for people with autism, because they're experiencing something they find difficult every single day. So if we think of anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, if we think someone without autism maybe starts their day about a 2, okay? So 1 being we're not particularly anxious at all, and 10 we're close to exploding. So we think about a 2, we're not too high up that scale. We're not a 1 because we've been asked to get out of bed. We've got to get up for work. No one likes that. As we climb through the day, we're kind of getting, we'll go from a 2, we'll go to a 3, maybe a 4 around lunchtime. We start to come back down when we start to go home. So you stick Coronation Street on, everything's fine, you wind back down, you get back down to a 1, you're relaxed and you go to sleep. And then it starts again the next day. If you add on all the difficulties such as not being able to predict things, or just the social interaction that occurs at school, or when you go into work, or even interacting with family members the same every single day, or being able to predict those changes that might occur of a morning, or knowing whether your supply teacher is going to be the same, whether there's going to be a roadblock on the way to school, am I going to be late, all of that stuff, that's going to put a child with autism more at, let's say, a 6 when they wake up. So then they encounter all of the same difficulties that everyone else does throughout the day, which is, rather than pushing them from a 2 to a 6 by the end of the day, they're going from a 6 and coming home at about a 9. So when they come in through the door and they haven't got their favourite chocolate bar available, that might be the icing on the cake, or the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's what causes our meltdowns in the end. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to see what's actually going on behind the surface, because there's all of this anxiety that bubbles up underneath. But even though we're all unique, we just have to remember that the difficulties, no matter how they're experienced, they can kind of cause this same outcome. We have to be aware of this underlying anxiety that can come alongside autism. So if we have a look at this slide then, this is a diagram that was kind of introduced by the National Autistic Society. It's kind of the best way to outline what autism is as a picture. So it's called the triad of impairments, triad meaning that there's kind of 3 elements to this. So we've got the social communication, social interaction, and the social imagination. Social communication refers to the way we communicate with other people, so that's both verbally and non-verbally. So we've got our how we speak to others, starting conversations, ending conversations, the words we literally say. And then we've got our non-verbal, which is recognising and creating our own facial expressions, our gestures, that kind of stuff. Then we've got our social interaction, which is understanding our social rules. So, for example, not shouting in a library, sitting down in school, the fact that rules at home and rules at school might be quite different. But then we've also got the other side of it, which is conducting relationships, how relationships work. So friendships, how to start one, and all the rules that kind of come alongside maintaining a friendship. On the other side, we've got the social imagination, which is also known as the restrictive and repetitive behaviour side of things, sometimes shortened to simply rigidity. So what that is being able to predict change, know what's going to happen in a day, and if that's difficult to predict, then it might cause some rigid behaviour. So if we didn't know what was going to happen, we'd try and create as much routine as we possibly could, and that's what children with autism do. If they're struggling to predict, they might try and alter situations slightly so the same thing happens every day, just to make that a bit more predictable and a little less anxiety provoking. Also in this presentation, we do talk about the sensory elements of autism. Now, in terms of the diagnostic criteria, sensory kind of comes in under the restrictive and repetitive behaviour, so that rigidity, because the sensory elements can kind of create some repetitive behaviours. But we're going to talk about it as a separate thing, just so we can get a bit more understanding of that. So that's kind of like a bonus that we're going to go through today. So we've got the social communication, social interaction, social imagination, and sensory.
Now we're going to look at social communication. Now our communication is made up of verbal, about 35%, and non-verbal, about 65%. Verbal includes both our expressive language, which is the words that we say, and receptive language, which are the words that we hear. It is important to note at this point that people on the autism spectrum can have short working memory. This means that they can't always hold a lot of information in their mind, and they can seem to forget things easily. It can also take them some time to think about what they want to say or to understand and act upon instructions. So let's think of some examples to kind of demonstrate this struggle with working memory. So if you have a voicemail with lots of information on it, such as a name, a phone number, a meeting place, an address, a time, and a date, how much of that information would you remember from just listening to it once? Probably not much of it, so you would likely have to listen to that voicemail more than once, and you would likely have to write things down, like the phone number or the meeting place, etc., to help remember it all. Now imagine that you could only retain one or two pieces of information, and you do not have the luxury of being able to replay that message. This is what it can be like for our children on the autism spectrum when they're being told information and given instructions. For example, they might be asked to go upstairs, get their shoes on and put their coat on. However, they might only process one of those instructions, so they go upstairs but then don't put their shoes on and don't put their coat on. Then this can lead others to think that they're not listening to them. Another example we can use with regards to working memory is some children really struggle with their processing speed of information. So some children can take up to 10 seconds to process one instruction. So let's have a test of what this might be like in real life. So imagine I'm asking you to do something and then we'll wait 10 seconds for you to respond. So can you pass me the pen in your hand, please? Okay, that's 10 seconds. That's quite a long time, isn't it? How many of you would actually wait that long for someone to respond to you? Not many, I bet. We would usually wait around 2 to 3 seconds for some sort of response, and then we would repeat that instruction again and again if needed, while gradually lightly getting more and more angry and feeling frustrated as we feel they're not listening to us. The problem with this is that each time you give that instruction again, that 10-second timer goes back to 0. Now 10 seconds is an extreme example, but this slower processing speed is something to think about when communicating with children and young people on the autism spectrum. Okay, so then we've got non-verbal communication. This includes like our facial expression, our eye contact, personal space, tone of voice. Think about how much we rely on these non-verbal cues. So for example, the way someone is standing, their facial expression and their tone of voice can really change the meaning of what they were saying. So for example, if someone winks at you, that would indicate that they are joking. So let's have a look at some common difficulties with regards to communication for our children with autism. So they might have difficulties with starting and ending a conversation, knowing when to talk, knowing what to say in a situation, knowing that we can talk about different things and how to talk to different people in different ways. So for example, the way you talk to a 4-year-old child might be different to the way you would talk to an adult, or the way you would talk to your boss might be different to the way you talk to your friends. And some children really struggle with knowing those social differences. Understanding sarcasm can be really difficult. Understanding facial expressions and tone of voice. And knowing that our non-verbal communication can change the meaning of our verbal words as well. So just to demonstrate kind of how difficult language can be, especially our non-literal language, let's have a look at some idioms from around the world. So here are a list of idioms. So the first one is, you have tomatoes on your eyes. The second one, you are inflating a cow. To slide in on a shrimp sandwich. Stop ironing my head. Not my circus, not my monkey. Do you have any ideas what these idioms mean? Let's have a look. So you have tomatoes on your eyes. It means you are not seeing what everyone else is seeing. You are inflating a cow. You are making something out to be bigger than it really is. To slide in on a shrimp sandwich means you didn't work to get where you are. Or we might say, born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Stop ironing my head means stop annoying me. And not my circus, not my monkey means not my problem. Okay, so these idioms really just show us how actually our non-literal language can be really complicated and hard to understand. So again, it's just worth bearing in mind our own language when we're talking to our children on the autism spectrum. So next then, we want to have a look at, okay, we know what some of the difficulties are, but what can we do about it? So some recommendations we would say is to start with the person's name. Some young people, when you address them in a group, they won't understand that instruction is for them, so they will continue doing what they're doing. Using simple language and instructions where you can. This just makes communication easier for everybody. Do not insist on eye contact. Some of our young people really struggle with this. So we would say to look maybe at someone's nose, their forehead, or towards their ears instead. Allow your child time to process information. Do you remember what we said about the 10-second processing speed? Well, take that into account when thinking about, can your child process what you're telling them? Using closed questions can be really helpful. For some young people and children, if we say to them, what would you like for tea? That question's massive. The choices are huge, and that can be really stressful. So if you say instead, oh, tonight you can have chicken or fish, that makes that choice a little bit easier for them. And if you do need to repeat something, try and say it in the exact same way. And allow them time to talk about the things that they've experienced from their own perspective. And that this is really important. As I said, some children really struggle to process things. So it might take them a little more time to kind of communicate what they want to say. So allow them that time to do that. Also, using visuals along with your verbal language can be really, really helpful. So if you remember the voice message example, If I'd give you that information in writing, you wouldn't need to keep listening to that voice message because you'd have it there in front of you on a piece of paper. And when we talk about the use of visuals, this can include like daily timetables, such as using a calendar or a diary to help structure the days. It can be a visual on how to do a task, like brush your teeth or get dressed. It could even be the use of social stories or comic strip conversations to help a child communicate or to explain things to them. And information on these things can be found on the National Autistic Society website. And using visuals can also reduce the need for a child or young person to keep asking the same questions over and over again. Hopefully you've found some of these recommendations useful. Now we'll move on to the next part, which is social interaction.
So social interaction refers to the basic social rules that we follow whilst being with other people. They involve things like personal space, eye contact, and noticing how others might be feeling or thinking, as well as some unwritten social rules. This comes from the theory of mind, which suggests that we can recognise that other people may think or feel differently to us. We can usually judge how the other person may respond to us, depending on how they seem. However, people with autism have something that is termed mind blindness, which means they struggle to do this. Can you remember a time when your parents sat you down and explained how to turn take in a conversation? Or how far to stand away from someone during a conversation? No, it's probably because they didn't. These are things that we just innately learn. However, children with autism don't learn these things naturally, so they need to be taught. Difficulties with social interaction tend to result in three main categories. The first is social avoidance. Children with autism may prefer to spend time on their own. Second, social awkwardness. Children with autism may want to make friends, but struggle to know how to do so. And the third is social indifference. Sometimes children with autism know that people are there if they need something, but they're quite happy with what they're doing. Generally speaking, all three categories are okay as long as the child has the skills that they need if they did want to interact with other people. It's important to find out if children are happy on their own or if they're frightened or anxious about spending time with others. If the latter is the case, then it's not healthy to keep avoiding situations, and instead children should be listened to, understood, and taught anxiety-reducing strategies in order to help them gently and slowly integrate with others. Common difficulties for children with autism in this area include difficulty seeing things from other people's perspective, knowing what to do in difficult situations, problem solving, knowing how others are thinking and feeling, making and maintaining friendships, knowing what the unwritten social rules are and the fact that they can change depending on different contexts, and understanding things like personal space and eye contact. So what can we do about it? Modelling is a really helpful way to show children with autism how to interact in different situations. It gives them a chance to learn from us. Sometimes breaking situations down into more simple, easy to understand scenarios can be helpful too. Social stories and using the media can be used as examples. And talking out loud is a helpful way for children to understand what we are thinking and feeling in different situations. It can be a way to normalise different thoughts, feelings and behaviours. You can also practice some turn-taking with exercises at home. And finally, autism alert cards can provide helpful hints and tips for children.
The third section of the triad is restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour, also known as rigidity. We all have routines and things that we like to do in the same order, but people with autism can be very rigid and don't like change. Have you ever noticed that your child likes to line up their belongings, sit in the same place, eat the same food, or watch the same programme over and over? This is because it is safe and predictable. People with autism often struggle with prediction, knowing what will happen next, who will be there, and so on.
They can also struggle with problem solving. Take this example. If we travel the same way to work every day, but then one day the road is closed, we would be annoyed and we would be anxious, but we'd also be able to problem solve and still get to work using a different route. However, a person with autism might not be able to manage this as easily. They may become extremely anxious and stuck and feel as if they need to take this route. This could make it hard for them to think of alternatives. There are also difficulties around generalising skills to different situations. So, if someone learns how to catch a bus from Stafford to Rugeley, they wouldn't necessarily know how to catch a bus from Rugeley to Tamworth. If a child has learned to ask the teacher for a snack at school, they may not automatically know how to ask their parent at home. People with autism can often like routines and to repeat things. This is because it is comforting and predictable and they don't have to think too much about it. This can also include repeating words and phrases or repeated body movements. We have discussed some of these already, but some of the common difficulties include not being able to predict what is going to happen next, not being able to accept other people's opinions, having very specific interests, repetitive behaviour and speech, frequent questioning and reassurance seeking, and difficulty trying new things. So what can we do about it? Well, have a predictable home life. Try and have a routine that you can stick to with your family. Plan, especially if going to a new place, like on holiday. A lot of airports have a virtual tour and lanyards, so you don't have to wait in a queue. You don't get physically searched and you can board the plane first or last. It's worth contacting the airport before you fly to see what they can do for you. Also, some shops have a certain time where the lights are dimmed down and the store is less busy and less noisy so that people with autism can go. Use visual resources such as timetables, social stories and pictures. Model the behaviour that you want to see. Children learn from the environment around them, and so this is a great way to help build skills in your child. Try It Tuesday. This is where you have a set menu for the week. This can be displayed visually for the child to see, but Tuesday could be left blank and it can be a surprise or something new to try on the menu. This is to slowly build in the change. Stick to what you say as this builds trust. For example, if you are out shopping and tell your child that you are going to 3 shops, then only go to 3 shops. If you then went to 5 shops, this would lead to a lack of trust and anxiety for the child the next time you go shopping. Remember, small steps at a time build confidence.
Okay, so let's have a look at the final section of what we're going to be talking about today, which is the sensory side of things. In terms of sensation, everyone experiences senses quite differently. Everyone is more sensitive or less sensitive than other people in terms of their different senses. Everyone's quite unique in it, which is why this area of managing behaviour can be quite difficult. Especially if someone is struggling to communicate exactly what the problem is, because when it comes to sensation, it's more bodily function, I suppose, as opposed to actually a thought process. So you might be too hot, or you might be smelling something that you don't like, or something might be too bright, and if you've got a load of other anxieties on top, you might not know what's actually kind of pushing you over the edge, what's causing you that extra bit of anxiety, so that can be difficult to communicate. In terms of our senses and how many we have, there's a bit of a debate. In schools, the standard 5 senses are taught, so you've got the taste, touch, hearing, smell and sight. But in terms of occupational therapy, in terms of the actual amount of senses that we've got, that's a bit up for debate, but we know that it's a lot more than the standard 5. Some common ones that come up in autism that might be useful to talk about today are also vestibular, which is just a fancy word for balance, and also proprioception. which again is an unnecessarily fancy word for kind of being aware of your own body, spatial awareness, knowing the distance of yourself from an object, that kind of thing. So just going over those again, we're going to cover taste, touch, sound, smell, sight, vestibular and proprioception. We're going to go over them individually, but just before we go into each sense individually and how that might affect, I want to have a quick look at this. So, as I said, every person experiences their sensations very differently. So while we all experience sound, one person might experience that sound as louder or more piercing or more annoying than another person. And that works with every sense. And our senses are different within ourselves. And what I mean by that is we might be extremely sensitive to sound, but we might be quite undersensitive to touch. So just because you're oversensitive in something doesn't mean that you're oversensitive in everything. So we're different between people, and our senses are different within ourselves as well. So those two black lines on the screen represent how we feel comfortable. So that is our comfortable zone in between the two black lines. If we go above that line, then that's where we go into kind of being overwhelmed by our sensation. And if we go below the black line on the other side where it says hyposensitivity, if we go below that black line, that's where we start to feel like we need some more stimulation. So just to discuss those terms on their own, hypersensitivity just means oversensitive. So that means if we go above the line, very sensitive, we don't like that. Hyposensitivity means we might struggle to get that amount of sensation, and so we might seek more of it. So looking at the lines in terms of the hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity, like I said earlier, those are going to vary between the senses. So if you think about it, those black lines that kind of show where we're comfortable, between each sense and between each person, those lines are going to be moved. So if you think of the bottom black line, by hyposensitivity, if we think in terms of audio sense, that person's sense is if something goes really, really quiet, so dead silence, that's when they're going to start to feel uncomfortable and they're going to start to begin sensory seeking behaviours, which we'll kind of go on to in a minute. By the hypersensitivity, when things are excruciatingly loud, so let's say someone shouts next to your ear or drops a baking tray behind you, that's when you're going to get the kind of startled response, or you might cover your ears to try and reduce some of that sensitivity. So if those lines were to move, so let's say another person, the hyposensitivity line, the line by the hypersensitivity, from the bottom, if we move that up slightly and we imagine how much more of the blue line, so the amount of sensation that's happening, is below that black line, is a lot more than the last person that we were discussing. So that person is going to start feeling like they need to sensory seek a lot more than the last person. If we look at hypersensitivity and you move that line down, that box of comfort is reducing massively. So it might be that that person actually experiences sounds as more annoying, even if they're quiet, because they're more sensitive to it than other people. So let's say rather than someone dropping a baking tray behind you, it's a ticking clock or static on a television or something like that. The further that line goes down, the more sensitive to sound you are. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are better hearing than other people. It just means that you are more susceptible to those sounds and you might find it harder to block them out. We just need to consider that in terms of all senses. So this blue line isn't just sound, it's also touch, it's also our taste, it's our smell, it's our balance, it's our spatial awareness. So we're very sensitive to some things, very undersensitive to others, and other things, it's like Goldilocks. Sometimes we get it just right. Yeah. Okay, so let's think of each sense on their own. So if we think about sound first, that's all of the stimulation that comes in through our ears, as you'd expect. In terms of hypersensitivity, so if someone is very, very sensitive, which you can see a lot in autism actually, you might see some covering ears or making repetitive sounds or being easily distracted if you're hypersensitive. Because if you imagine if you're too sensitive to this sort of stuff and you've got ticking clocks in your room, so let's imagine school situation. You've got pupils moving chairs, teachers talking, there's other people having conversations in the room. You've got papers shuffling, pens clicking, chairs moving, and clocks ticking, that sort of stuff. And there's loads of these sounds going on all at the same time. You're trying to listen to instructions and you've got all this distraction stuff going on. That's no good for you. If we have a startle noise, so something that's way over that comfortability line, and we're very sensitive, then we cover our ears. If our kind of black line, our level of comfortability is very, very low, and we're quite sensitive, people are going to start covering their ears a lot earlier. So that's why some children with autism, you may see some ear covering. Maybe if you're just out in the supermarket or something like that, it might sound like there's not a lot going on, but there is a ton of sound kind of stimulation coming from inside a supermarket. So that might cause a child to start covering their ears because they're trying to decrease the amount of stimulation that they're getting from the environment. If we think about hyposensitivity, so they're not getting enough sound, they may also make repetitive sounds. Now, this is the interesting part and why sensation is very difficult to pinpoint what's actually needed for each person. It's very trial and error with every single person that needs support with this. If someone's making repetitive sounds, they may be trying to create more noise for themselves. So the environment isn't stimulating enough, so they're creating more noises. So they're clicking, they're maybe talking louder than everyone else in the room because they're just not detecting that they're louder. But they also might make repetitive sounds to block out other noises. So let's say if they're hypersensitive, oversensitive, then that ticking clock might be so annoying that you start humming over the top of it. If you're louder than that ticking clock, you're going to start to block it out. So you could make repetitive sounds to create your own noise, either to make the environment more comfortable by adding noise or by reducing background noise yourself. That's why this stuff's very difficult. Other hyposensitive kind of behaviours might be seeking loud noises, so you get children that will get toys that make noise and they'll put them to their ear, or they'll sit very close to the television, that sort of thing, or put their ears to speakers, things like that, because they just need more noise. But that's kind of everything to do with audio. It does what it says on the tin. If you're oversensitive to things, you're going to avoid noise. If you're undersensitive to things, you're going to seek noise. If you can't find that noise, that's when you're going to start to see kind of, I suppose, more lethargic behaviour, because you're not getting any stimulation, which kind of gives a bit of a sleepy reaction. Okay. So the next one to consider is touch. If you're hypersensitive to touch, you could be irritated by certain textures. Quite often, well, I suppose actually it varies in terms of what each child prefers. Because if we think about cotton, cotton can be very scratchy material, but then at the same time, silk can be very slimy feeling if you're very sensitive. They may not like messy play. They might find that very difficult, so getting their hands dirty, so playing with slime and stuff like that. And sometimes a big thing that we see is touch being painful. So it's almost like if someone bumps into you, you experience that bump on a more significant level than someone that's not as sensitive might. So it can almost feel like someone's deliberately done it because it hurts. So it's not just a bump, it's they've hit you sort of thing. So that's why if you mix that sort of thing with difficulties with social understanding, it might be that you haven't recognised that person didn't mean to hurt you, they just bumped into you by accident. But because it's painful and you don't understand what's going on in terms of the social aspects of it, you might take that as a personal attack. Hyposensitivity in this area, people may seek tight clothing or touch. So they may may want the clothing to be tighter so they can get more feedback from it. At the same time, though, again, just to put a bit of a difficult spin on it, a person that is oversensitive may also seek tight clothing, because if we imagine if you've got loose clothes on, so a person that's hypersensitive will typically try and wear baggy clothes or something like that, something that's not going to be on their skin as much. But if you're wearing very loose trousers, for example, and every time you walk, those trousers kind of touch your skin and then don't touch your skin and then touch your skin because they're waving about everywhere, that's going to start to get irritating because of the on and off sensation. If you think about the wearing tighter clothing, it's almost constant sensation, so it's not an on and off annoyance. So sometimes people that are hypersensitive may wear tighter clothing in public, purely because it stops that on-off stimulation. It'll give constant stimulation, and that's probably preferable to some people than having like an annoyance that comes and goes. Some people that are hyposensitive may run their hands over certain textures, so you see children walking in the hallways of schools running their fingers along things. They might do it in supermarkets along the produce. It can cause issues when they do it along the wine bottles. We've all been there. And they may love that messy play. So things like slime, playing in mud, wet sand, stuff like that, they're going to love it. That's all that feedback that they want to try and get them up into their area of comfort. I kind of put taste and smell together. Excuse me. Put taste and smell together because they kind of are accompanied by this, what we call gustatory sense. So it's kind of to do with your internal working digestive system sort of thing. And they kind of interact with each other. So your smell is going to affect your taste, and your taste affects your smell, and that kind of thing. And it's very evolutionary, I guess. Your sensation is there to tell you what is happening in your environment. It keeps you safe. If you hear loud noises, you get startled. You turn to look at what the noise is and things like that. If you taste something that you haven't tasted before, or you smell something that smells particularly strong, is it poisonous? Is it going to hurt you if you eat it? That sort of thing. Is it going to make you ill? So these senses can be alarming if they're kind of if you're oversensitive, because that means that you might prefer plainer diets and that kind of thing, because it might be off-putting to your system that's trying to protect you. So someone that's hypersensitive may avoid strong smells and tastes, so they'll just like blander diets, like I said. So you've got your mashed potato and chicken, all the staples. You may notice a change of perfume or washing powder, things that you could never guess you would ever notice. So they might smell ingredients within foods that you would usually think you're not going to notice, that sort of thing, because they're just being able to pick out those specific smells. If we imagine that on a level in terms of audio, so you've got the sounds that are happening in a classroom, and a child is picking out all of those individual sounds from the environment and finding it difficult to block out. Think of that in terms of the smell. So rather than smelling your dinner, you've got all of the ingredients that are in that dinner. You may prefer things to not touch on the plate, or being touching in the mouth. So what we mean by that is spaghetti on its own and the sauce on its own taste completely different. Mix spaghetti and the sauce, and it's got a different texture, it's got a different taste, it's got a different smell, that sort of thing, because they're mixed together. So children may prefer to keep those things separate. That can be slightly because of the rigidity thing. So for example, you eat your meat first, then you eat your veg, then you eat whatever's left, and you eat your food in a certain order. And you like to keep those things separate. On a sensory level, it may be that the mashed potato touching the chicken is completely changing the taste and the texture of the chicken, and you just don't want that taste and texture. That ruins the meal for you. If you're hyposensitive, you may seek those stronger smells and tastes. So bear in mind, when we're thinking about that blue line, we're trying to get above that bottom black line. So may explore the environment with taste and smell. So quite often we explore with our eyes, but we also explore with smell quite often as well. So before we taste something new, we'll usually give it a bit of a smell. But children, if they're struggling to understand social situations and things like that, they may explore other people with taste and smell as well. So you might get children that maybe lick people when they've met them for the first time, or they might go up to them and smell them, because it's kind of giving them a better sense of who that person is. It's how they're exploring the environment. They may seek the strong smells like strong fish or just anything strong smelling really, and like to have that in their diet. And also another thing to mention is pica. So this is a separate condition altogether, and we would recommend going to see your GP if you suspect there's an issue with pica. What pica is a person that's unable to distinguish what is edible and what is not. So they will eat all sorts of stuff. So stones, batteries, anything that a person could get their hands on. And the best thing to do in that situation is just monitor the person as much as you possibly can, to try and remove any objects that they're trying to eat that aren't edible and might be harmful to them, but then also seek support from your GP to try and find a service that will be able to provide some additional support for that. Like we said, it's a separate condition. So if we have a look at the next sense, we have sight. Now, hypersensitivity to sight might mean that we seek darker environments or prefer duller colours, and we may be distracted by our busy environments when there's a lot of stuff going on. So instead of liking full room lights on, we prefer having lamps, fairy lights, that sort of thing. May like to go to a dark area, and prefer plainer colours on the walls in the bedroom and that kind of thing, because anything else is almost like too much. It's a kind of a difficult kind of sensation to describe, really. It's just, you get this feeling of just this is too much. It's almost loud, if you like. There's too much information in the environment, too bright. So with the distraction by the busy environment, if you're trying to understand all the social situations and things, as we keep mentioning, and you're trying to process all the visual information, supermarkets, I can't stress enough, are possibly the worst environment in the world for a person with autism that's got any kind of sensory difficulty, because you've got everything in that building is trying to grab your attention. So you've got the smell of the fish counter, the smell of the bakery, the smell of the deli counter, all of the advertisements, low offers, 50% off, come and buy this, come and buy that. Then you've got people moving around, interacting with each other. You've got to figure out who's staff, who are people just going to the shop, and trying to pick out all of that information in an environment where you can't concentrate because there's too much visual stimulation and sound stimulation and smell stimulation, and just about everything that's going on in that room can be almost an impossible task. If we look at the hyposensitivity in terms of sight, they may really enjoy stimming behaviours. And what we mean by stimming behaviours is kind of messing with the light. So they may hold their fingers up in front of their face and wiggle their fingers, because that kind of gives a bit of a light manipulation. And then they may enjoy turning lights on and off, because they might enjoy having that control over the stimulation. They may just seek bright lights, so they may hold lights up to their eyes and things like that, just to push themselves into that zone of comfortability. The next one, the first fancy word, vestibular. This is what we say is balance, so it's kind of regulated by your inner ear. If you're hypersensitive, it doesn't take a lot to make you dizzy. Standing up too fast, turning your head too quickly, it's almost like your balance is so finely tuned that anything can throw it out. So these people may prefer to lie down or be calm or still, not move around very much. It's not necessarily because they're trying to avoid dizziness, it's just their body's telling them that they are balanced and they don't need to seek any additional sensation. Hyposensitivity, on the other hand, you can't stop them moving. So they'll be rocking, they'll be spinning, hanging upside down. They'll test their space, which I'll go on to in a minute with the next one in proprioception, but these two are kind of very closely linked. And you may also see some of this risky behaviour. Again, the risky behaviours may be linked to the not understanding what the danger is. But if your body is telling you you need to test your balance, you need to get more stimulation from balance, climbing up on something high up and standing on something thin to test your balance is really going to give you that feedback that you like. It's going to start pushing you up into that zone of comfortableness, which is going to be the exact opposite for someone that's hypersensitive, that likes to keep their feet on the ground and keep as kind of a calm environment as possible. In terms of proprioception, so that's the spatial awareness. So if you look at the picture, the guy that's unfortunately hit his thumb when he was aiming for the nail, that's because he can't tell how far away his thumb is from that nail and can't see where the hammer is going. It's got nothing to do with vision at all. It's more to do with depth perception. So he's completely missed the nail and walloped his thumb instead. People that have got hypersensitivity in this area may feel quite closed in, and they may prefer the loose clothes. Hyposensitivity, on the other hand, very fidgety, walking into things. They may prefer the tight clothing and may have a bit of a floating feeling we've had described. It's almost like the hyposensitivity is you have very low sense of spatial awareness where your body is in space. So you're walking towards a table and you intend to walk around it, but you don't know how far away that table is from you. You can see how far away it is, but in terms of the proportions of your body, you might be unaware of that. So you bump it with your hip or something. With the tight clothing, that's more to feel grounded. So it's almost like if you're not aware of where you are in the space that you're in, it's kind of like you're floating around, so you don't know where you are in relation to things, and you can feel kind of just kind of out in the middle. So you might wear the tight clothing and things like that because it gives your body the feeling that you are very grounded and safe now, because you've got something to keep you in that space. So you might see people like to have carry heavy things around with them, or have a heavy rucksack, or they might squeeze themselves into tight corners, things like that. So they're not in an open space, they're kind of enclosed. You might also see some of this tiptoe walking as well. That's partly to do with touch, but also partly to do with proprioception. It's very difficult to kind of pick all these senses out from one another because it's all working in close union with our whole entire bodily system, really. So it's difficult to pull them apart. But tiptoe walking, two things really. You might be trying to reduce the feedback that you're getting from the soles of your feet by standing on your toes, or you might be trying to increase the sensation that you're getting through your toes. So kind of pinpoint intense stimulation that you get through the bottom, a specific part of your feet, whereas the other part is reducing it by removing most of your foot off the floor. So yeah, the proprioception, you see a lot of people testing their space, like I said, in vestibular. The thing with testing the space is, if you imagine someone is sat on a chair, they can't see the back of the chair, and their body has to keep checking that it's there for them. So they might bounce against the back of the chair, or wrap their legs around the legs of the chair, so that they're getting feedback. So their brain is going, yep, the chair's still there, you're not going to fall over, don't worry about it. So it just keeps testing the environment, really, because your brain isn't doing it for you. It needs more information. That's what all this sensory stuff is: more information. So with this, with all of the sensory stuff, it's very, very difficult, because it's one of those things that the child just can't help. It's like if you imagine in a classroom and a child's struggling to sit still, Are they trying to irritate you, or are they really, really struggling? So if someone told you to sit in a room that was too hot while someone is shouting at you in the face and they tell you to do complicated maths equations, you're going to start to hit that 10 on the scale of 1 to 10 very, very quickly. And this is what some of these children are experiencing. So high sensitivity in a classroom environment, they're going to struggle to start doing their work and things. So what we have to try and do is do some detective work on these sensory sensitivities. Try and find out where your child is in terms of their senses. Are they seeking behaviour? Are they avoiding behaviour? That kind of thing. Try and pinpoint what that sense is. Like I've already noted, it's very difficult and is often trial and error. And just try and replace the sense with something that's appropriate. So we'd never say, just tell the child to stop doing what they're doing. Stop rocking, stop spinning, stop hanging upside down. It's, can we find an alternative? And if the original behaviour isn't particularly problematic, so they might be rocking at the back of the classroom, but are they distracting anyone? Is it really a problem? Then just leave it alone, because they're doing that so they can concentrate more. Because if you're in that comfortable zone, that is where your optimum concentration is going to be. But if your behaviour is a risk to you, so they're climbing up on high things, or if you're putting things in your mouth that you shouldn't be putting in your mouth, eating everything, seeking balance in risky situations, if you're walking into things, all of that sort of stuff, or all your senses are stressing you out, so you feel overwhelmed quite a lot. What can we do to change their behaviour so it's more appropriate? So instead of tipping a chair backwards and forwards while you're sat on it, which could cause you some injury, could we say, I don't know, you can rock backwards and forwards and bounce on the chair, or you could have a wobble cushion on the chair, or you could have like a resistance band that you put around the legs of the chair for the child to bounce their feet off. It's just trial and error of all these sensory things, and there are a couple of websites that you can get things off. So there's cheap disability aids, and romper.com are quite good examples, because there's some companies put some of these very, very simple ideas for sensory processing equipment at a very high price for some unknown reason. So you can get them off those websites, but also a great place that I recommend is at any supermarket. If you go to the party aisle, it's full of sensory stuff. So you've got the stretchy people, you've got things that make noise, you've got bubble machines, you've got all sorts of stuff. Anything in that sensory aisle, the cheap rubbish little toys that come in the plastic bags, like you usually get them toy soldiers or toy footballers and things like that. Anything that's in that aisle is usually sensory related, and you can get it for like a couple of pounds. So I'd recommend having a look around. Try and get stuff cheap. Don't spend a lot of money in one go on something that you're not sure if it will work. It's best to do trial and error, and then get the better stuff when you're certain that that's going to help. Okay. Like I was mentioning a minute ago, it's difficult to tell whether the child is doing this behaviour on purpose or not. We get these questions an awful lot about what is a tantrum and what is a meltdown, because quite often children with autism, they can't necessarily control what's happening. It's a kind of outburst of anxiety. They're terrified, they don't know what's going on, they don't know how to control it, and this burst of anger comes out. It's almost fight or flight response. I need to protect myself, something bad is happening, and their body has gone into almost animal caveman protective mode. I need to be saved from this. But at the end of the day, they're still kids. They push buttons, they have tantrums, and they see what they can get away with, and it's quite difficult to tell the difference sometimes. But to kind of try and put it in a very simplistic way, obviously it's a lot more difficult than this, but if you can try and spot these signs, a tantrum is going to be goal-driven. That's the most important thing. So if a child is having throwing a bit of a wobbler because they want a packet of sweets, or they've been at the shops too long and they've decided that they want to go home, if you were to give them the sweets, or if you were to take them home, would that behaviour stop? If it stops, it's a tantrum. If it doesn't stop, it's meltdown, because they're now no longer in control of that behaviour. So when their goal is achieved, that behaviour completely, it's almost eradicated. There's no more purpose. The behaviour is purposeful. So almost as if I know exactly what I want and I know how to get it, and they will keep repeating behaviour that has worked previously. For things like this, we're looking at creating some separate resources for behaviour that people find challenging, to manage kind of temper tantrums and help with meltdowns and stuff like that. So we won't cover it in this presentation, but if you do want to contact us to see what resources we have, what other videos we've got online and things like that, we're happy to help with all this stuff. But just to keep it simple for this presentation, just bear in mind a tantrum, goal driven, it stops when that goal is achieved. So they get what they want and they know how to get it. And the behaviour can escalate, but there is evidence of control. So that's seen in their eyes, if you like. You can kind of see when they're controlling that behaviour. So if they're not getting it, they'll push it a bit further. They'll push that button a little bit more. They'll keep going and keep going and keep going. And you can see that there's an element of control in it at all times. In terms of a meltdown, on the other hand, complete loss of control. So I've had described to me this glazed over look. So it's almost like the lights are on but nobody's home kind of thing. So they've completely lost control of their actions. They're terrified, and you might see the screaming and the hitting and things like that. And it seems to be that no matter what you do, nothing is calming that situation down. So originally it could have started as they wanted a bag of sweets, but now it's escalated to the point where you could give them all the sweets in the world and it's not making a difference. Nothing will stop the behaviour, and unfortunately with a meltdown, it just has to be seen through until the end. So the best thing to do is watch from a distance, make sure that the person is okay. So if they're throwing things around, they're not damaging themselves or they're not damaging anybody else. And if they are hitting out, then you need to move away, particularly if, say it's an older teenager or something like that. If you are aware of, let's say if you experience these meltdowns on a daily basis and you're very, very well aware of what can help with the meltdown, so what can make it subside quicker. Let's say if the child is particularly touch sensitive or proprioception sensitive, and they like a nice big tight hug because that makes them feel a lot safer, that might take the edge off the meltdown a little bit. And while their emotions will still be running high, it might reduce some of the behaviour, but that is person dependent. So as a parent, you know your child best. If you have seen that behaviour help before, then obviously keep doing what works. But in a meltdown, safety is priority. So just make sure that you're keeping yourself safe and the child is safe. And if you need any additional help, then it's calling the relevant services. So yeah, that's all for the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown. It's literally what the purpose of the behaviour is. Meltdowns have no purpose. It's almost the brain has taken over to try and keep the child safe. Tantrum is to get something or to avoid something, or there is a goal behind it.
So we've spoken a lot about some of the difficulties your children may experience, but it's extremely important to recognise the strengths that your children also possess. So things like honesty. They have a great sense of humour. They can be incredibly knowledgeable about certain subjects. Their organisation skills can be really good. Punctuality, their memory for certain things can be absolutely amazing. And they have a really good eye for detail. It's important to remember that whilst people with autism can learn everything that we can do, we can't learn these natural strengths that they are born with, thanks to having that amazing, fantastic autism brain. There are a lot of famous people who have autism, or who we believe would have been diagnosed if it had been recognised at the time. These include people like Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and people like Dan Aykroyd and Tim Burton. There are so many people now who have this diagnosis. There's a young actress who's currently in Hollyoaks at the minute who has a diagnosis, and people like Anne Hegarty off The Chase and Chris Packham, he's done a documentary on what it's like to live with autism. So it is becoming much more widely understood. There's also a special branch of Google in America who only employ people on the autism spectrum, as they need to have their special abilities, that eye for detail and incredible focus. They even have the interviews spread over several days and have the office space autism friendly. Whatever happens, it's important to remember that everybody is completely unique. Everybody's completely different. We tend to say if you've met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. No two people are the same. Your children are completely unique. And it's important to remember, whatever happens, autism doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
We are coming to the end of our presentation now, but before you go, we thought it would be useful to supply you with some useful websites that might be good to look at with regards to understanding a bit more about the autism spectrum and ways to help your child. So we've got the National Autistic Society, Autism West Midlands, and also our very own website, which has got some really useful information. So that's it for this presentation. Thank you for listening.